Good evening, everyone. I'm Stephanie Pointer, GI doc located in the Nashville, Tennessee area, and I would like to thank you all for joining us for tonight's webinar on developing a personal brand. I'd like to thank our coordinators, Marcia and the team, for the excellent job you guys have done in getting this all arranged. Let me tell you, you are definitely in for a treat tonight as I welcome you to and introduce you to Dr. Eric Esrailian. He is a phenomenal human being, as you'll soon come to see, and we graciously thank him for leading our webinar tonight. I'm just going to give you a little bit of information on Dr. Esrailian. He is the chief of the Division of Digestive Diseases at UCLA, where he is a health sciences clinical professor of medicine. He attended the University of California at Berkeley for his undergraduate studies and subsequently graduated from the Loma Linda University School of Medicine and completed a residency in internal medicine at the University of Southern California. He completed his gastroenterology fellowship at UCLA, where he also went on to obtain an MPH with the assistance of an NIH training grant. He is also a graduate of the Executive Program in Management for the UCA Anderson School of Management. He served on the Medical Board of California from 2010 to 2011 after being appointed by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. In addition to disease areas within gastroenterology and internal medicine, he has a particular interest in the development of biomedical innovations, value in healthcare, medical education, initiatives towards patient-centered care, and connections between health and human rights. In 2012, he was awarded the Lindsay Foundation Chair in Clinical Gastroenterology by the UCLA School of Medicine. And he was also named the 43rd Annual Lester Breslau Distinguished Scholar and Lecturer by the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. He is also an Emmy-nominated film producer, investor, and entrepreneur. Most notably, he produced The Promise by Terry George, starring Oscar Isaac and Christian Bale. He also produced the educational companion documentary, Intent to Destroy, with Joe Berlinger, which was nominated for an Outstanding Historical Documentary Emmy. These films and the accompanying social impact campaigns drew unprecedented attention to the Armenian genocide, contributed to the US government recognition of the historical facts, and led to the creation of the Promise Institute for Human Rights and the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA. In 2019, he and his partners at Forgotten Man Films launched SOMM, S-O-M-M TV, a new streaming service with original series, films, and masterclasses dedicated to wine and food. In partnership with the UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television, he produced Francesco about Pope Francis's efforts to deal with some of the biggest crises facing the world. He is actively involved in philanthropy in his community. In 2021, he was honored by Pope Francis at the Vatican with the Benemerenti Medal for his humanitarian activities around the world. Guys, I told you that Dr. Esrailian is an amazing, inspiring, and humble human being. Thank you so much, Dr. Esrailian, for leading this webinar tonight, and we are very excited to learn from you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And please call me Eric. And I'm truly honored and humbled to not only get a chance to meet you and work with you, but also to have a chance to talk to many of our AGA colleagues around the country. I feel really fortunate to be able to do so, and I hope we have some fun and have a chance to actually have some dialogue in a little bit. So I promised Stephanie and our AGA organizers that I would not have a lot of slides, so I hope that's a relief for some of you out there. But I definitely have a lot that I want us to talk about. So I will share my screen for just one moment because I want us to just have a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. So I'm just getting that set up. So, basically I wanted to keep this informal. I have a lot that I've gone through in my life that I'll share some parts of it with you, and then we'll kind of dovetail and discuss how that affects me and how that affects my perception of a brand, and then how I think that is relatable to everybody out there in terms of what you do every day and how you might want to formulate a brand or not. I think that there is a lot of things that I've gone through that really maybe unique to me, but I think if we think about everybody's personal experiences, there may be lessons that each of you can kind of employ in your own lives. And I really do think it's a great question, a great topic, and I commend the AGA for thinking about it, because what is a brand, and should physicians try to develop one? So we'll talk about that, and then, like I said, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So I'm going to stop the screen share so we can just kind of talk a little bit more informally. I'd like to tell you just a little bit about myself, just because I want you to understand, why do I do all these kind of like seemingly unusual things for a gastroenterologist, and how does that kind of translate into what people think of me, and is that a brand or not? So I'm really the child of refugees and immigrants. That's my whole family, and the circumstances that brought me to this country, gave me the opportunities that I've had. And I'm the great-grandchild of Armenian genocide survivors. And so some of what Stephanie mentioned is really relevant, because it's a big part of who I am. But I always think that the odds of me being right here, right now, talking to all of you and such esteemed colleagues are minuscule. So I think about that every day. And when I was a child, I loved science, I loved medicine. I always felt like this was a calling, and I always felt like I wanted to be a doctor. And my earliest memories really are of me trying to study and wanting to learn about science and pursue medicine. I had the good fortune of going to Berkeley, where I studied biology and English. I majored in biology and minored in English because, again, my parents were kind of new to the country, and they kept on saying, "Why do you keep taking English classes? I thought you spoke English." So it took a while, but I ended up getting convincing them to allow me to minor in English. But it was also my first introduction at Berkeley to public health, and I actually became a TA in public health at Berkeley at one point. And then my best friend from college and I decided to go to Loma Linda for medicine together. And I was really intrigued by the school's focus on whole person care. And there, I actually met Bruce Runyon, who is a world-renowned hepatologist, and he really lit a fire under me and instilled an interest in gastroenterology and hepatology. So I followed Dr. Runyon to USC, where he had moved as a faculty member. And USC has a historic liver unit and tradition in GI and hepatology. And then my dream was really to train at UCLA. And UCLA actually offered me an opportunity to study public health and health services organizations. And after joining the faculty, I was able to also complete a one-year executive program at Anderson. And public health kind of opened up a different world for me, because I started thinking about helping populations of people. And in medicine, we're trained really to help one person at a time. But then I started really thinking about how can I help a community? How can I help populations? And now this day at UCLA, these days, it is really relevant to what I do every day. But my life was already kind of changing, because I became more involved in various aspects of the university, and then helping my community in Los Angeles around me and around the university and the Armenian community kind of worldwide. So soon after joining the division, I was kind of drafted in a situation where the division had numerous needs. Many faculty members needed support, and there were a lot of things going on within the institution. So I had to kind of partner with some friends of mine in the community and try to bring resources into the division and the university as a whole, because there were massive needs. And it's a much longer story, and I don't want to bore you all this evening, but I ultimately became more involved with trying to help underserved populations, not just through healthcare, but with philanthropy, politics, government, lobbying and advocacy, and then working with human rights organizations. And as Stephanie mentioned, I was really fortunate because of a collective effort from people for decades and decades, I was just able to kind of take it across the goal line. So we were able to get the United States government to recognize the Armenian genocide. And even though it was a long time ago, obviously, many of my kind of advocates and colleagues in the community say, the wound was still open. And I do think it was relevant because of so many things happening to people around the world. And last year in Armenia, there were sad echoes of previous atrocities. So it really it's not something that was just in historical times. So it really is a big part of kind of what I do and who I am and how I approach problems and think about prioritizing what I spend my time on. And as Stephanie mentioned, we had the honor of also creating this Human Rights Institute, the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA, and it's now one of the premier academic institutes of its kind in the world. So through that institute, I've been able to meet and collaborate and interact with people all over the world. And it really brings me a lot of pride to see how many physicians actually are part of these major institutions around the world, such as the International Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders and many other human rights organizations have leadership with healthcare training. So that has been a big part of my kind of growth as a professional. And I've been thinking about this evening and thinking about talking to all of you. It made me think about how my journey may or may not translate into a brand. So as I mentioned, over the years, I've been drafted into different roles within medicine, my community in Los Angeles, but as a consequence, it took me away from other things. I mean, there are only 24 hours in the day. So, I had to always think about, is there an opportunity cost with me spending time on certain things versus others? And, these different roles took me away, for example, from research, which I was, more actively involved with when I was training. Clinical care, which was a big part of what I did when I first started as a faculty member, even involvement with the GI societies. I recently, over the last 2 years, have been involved with the AGA Foundation, Research Foundation. And, I'm kind of utilizing my skill sets and then also my abilities to help bring resources into the AGA to support young scientists. And the ACG side, with the American College of Gastroenterology, I recently became involved with the ACG Institute and really helping to provide resources so we could help create opportunities for underrepresented minorities in our GI societies. So, I think, I took kind of a hiatus from society involvement because I was so involved locally and globally, ironically. So, it's just something that happened over time, but then I had to make a decision, what am I really trying to focus on? Am I really trying to focus on helping as many people as possible or increasing my profile within like a GI society? I just didn't do it. But I don't have any regrets. It's just the reality. It's just the path that I went on. And I now work very closely with the chancellor and various deans across the campus, in addition to overseeing digestive diseases myself. But, because I love GI and I do think it's a critically important field, I'm trying to always bring both digestive diseases and medicine as a part of what I do. And I always tell people, I'll always be a physician. I was trained as a physician to help people, but now I try to help people in different ways through medicine, trying to advocate for the university because the university is like a home for me, and also through storytelling, because I feel like that's one thing where one area in which physicians just don't have as much training. I have a background in English and writing and storytelling, and I probably use that as much as I use my medical skills these days. But I think that it is relevant in terms of trying to articulate why people, for example, should support science. People do that in the AGA all the time, in terms of lobbying for why we should get insurance providers to cover early colorectal cancer screening. We have to tell that story to lawmakers, et cetera. So I think, for me, I'm always kind of conscious of what I'm doing. And as a brand, I think that it hopefully is clear to people, but it does take time to do that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I'll say for myself, when I think about what exactly my kind of quote unquote brand is, I'm always really conscious of my responsibilities now, because I represent not only myself and my family, but the university as a whole. I also represent people around the world, kind of given my visibility on various issues. So there are some things that I may not be able to say publicly because it doesn't represent the institution well, for example. And that's something for you to think about, all of you, as you start to kind of craft what your brand is, so to speak. So let's talk just a little bit about what exactly a brand is. And I think it's hard to find a definition that everybody will agree on, but the American Marketing Association basically defines a brand as a name, a term, a design, a symbol, or any other feature that identifies one seller's good or service as distinct from those of other sellers. Now, as physicians, we don't like to think of ourselves as sellers. I think in many ways, I think cheapens kind of the value of what we do as healthcare providers. Particularly, all of you I know have been working diligently through the pandemic, literally saving lives, helping people throughout society. And I have to say, if it wasn't for physicians and scientists and healthcare providers, nurses, the entire healthcare community, where would we be right now? So I think this is a very important time for physicians and all of you out there to think carefully about how you want to position yourself in the world, because you're coming from, and hopefully, a very high level of respect in society. Now, of course, everybody's overwhelmed, and like the burdens on the healthcare system have been well documented. I know everybody has been dealing with that personally, but I think, again, you remember those early days of the pandemic where people were cheering physicians and cheering healthcare workers. I hope we haven't lost that, and I think all of you, especially if you're in training, are coming out of your training with so many people feeling a level of respect for physicians and the healthcare community. So I think you have to be aware of that as you start to take on certain elements of a brand. To me, as I went through that definition, I thought it really is a combination of various things, because we're not Coca-Cola, we're not Nike. Now your organization may be a brand. And actually UCLA at one point was, and I'm aware of this because our former CEO and I used to talk about it quite a bit, is that how UCLA was a recognizable brand on par with many other brands that I mentioned, like things like Disney and Nike and Coca-Cola. But as individual physicians, I think it's a little bit more of a challenge, because especially if you're a clinician and patients come and see you on a regular basis, you have to be really conscious of how you portray yourself, because I think a brand is a combination of who you are, or at least how people perceive you. And it can be you as a physician, a practice, a business, or even as a person. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a product or an identity, but there is quite a bit of perception. And I think that when I really try to drill down on what a brand means, the perception keeps coming to the surface. How do people perceive you or me or us? The AGA has a brand. If you think about it, people say that all the time. The AGA is like X and ACG is like Y, and ASLD is like, Z, and then we have ASGE, So what is the brand of AGA? And I know that from firsthand experience, these organizations work really hard to craft that and to hone it and improve it. And we should do the same thing as individuals. And some of you have even asked in advance, for example, the use of social media. So we can talk about that in the Q&A. But it doesn't have to be exclusively social media like Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, but even the use of digital media or digital, kind of advertising to be able to reach people and for them to be able to reach you. I can tell you, when I was a fellow at UCLA, I wanted to work on a website for our division because it was almost a static website with a couple of links and stock photos. I'm sure you've all seen stock photos before of somebody who looks like a physician. They have a stethoscope and they're smiling. And I thought, why don't we have pictures of our actual faculty? Well, I had a colleague at one point say, Eric, nobody uses the internet. So you can see I'm trying not to age myself, but when I started fellowship in 2003, that's what I was told. So it took a couple of years, and then I was able to try to get some people to work on the website. And now we actually have a lot of people doing that, obviously, and we have an entire media relations team that's outstanding at UCLA. But in my own division now, we have many people who are actively working on kind of crafting their own profiles and building on the kind of ecosystem and environment around them. So for those of you who work in universities or larger kind of centers, I do encourage you to think about what you can do to build on, assuming you like that environment around you, to build on that. So for me, it's UCLA. Like, because of all the other things I do, we're linked very, very closely. But even many of my colleagues who basically maybe have joined UCLA, I always tell them that you are kind of the tip of the iceberg, and there's an entire iceberg of UCLA right behind you. So you should think about how to utilize that in your community. For social media for physicians, especially during the pandemic, I think it's also become very difficult because some people want to give medical advice on social media, or and I think that really is, there's a lot of great resources in our GI societies about social media, but I think, and my advice is to always be very careful about things like that, because you can run into issues with HIPAA if you're not really thoughtful about what you're doing. And B, I think it may not even be responsible because of not knowing patient circumstances, and it's just, I think you have to again think about how you are perceived, right? So advice and editorializing on social media, it will follow you. So I'm very conscious of that for myself. And so because of all the other things that I'm involved with, I have to be really cautious about what I will talk about, what I will post about. And oftentimes, it's something that is vetted with many people because it involves me. So that's not necessarily the same for every single person. So I always advise people, still imagine that you are in that situation where you have to be careful. And like me, you have a lot of people looking at every word that you're writing. And then, it's like the old adage, measure twice and cut once, but I also think that, we are not really trained or encouraged to do salesmanship or salespersonship as physicians. But nevertheless, I think, because of the difficulties in accessing care and sometimes the difficulties in accessing information, especially during the pandemic, I think if a doctor is offering services, I think there's nothing wrong with trying to kind of convey that availability. Because when I give talks to our fellows about professionalism, it comes up over and over again that availability is a key for so many patients. I mean, especially during the crisis that we're all been going through with the pandemic, there are communities that are particularly underserved that need access to high quality care. So if a physician is available, I think there's nothing wrong with actually promoting and encouraging them to convey that availability. But, I think there's an art to it, to the point that I believe that physicians should be, kind of using that stature that they have, carefully, so that they don't come across as just a corporation. I mean, many of us, obviously, we're part of a business in healthcare. Even our colleagues who work in like the VA, for example, which are really providing like unbelievable care to veterans. The VA does want to make sure that there is a certain amount of throughput through its clinics and endoscopy units, and making sure that there is a source of revenue that isn't being wasted. The government does that. So I think we need veterans to know, for example, that it's time for their colon cancer screening, and there is availability at a certain location. And you'd be surprised in different communities how many people have access to cell phones and social media even if they may not have access to healthcare on a regular basis. So I think there's a way to utilize social media for good and not necessarily for all the things that we've heard that could be detrimental from social media. And as you've all seen, and recently our Surgeon General gave a report about the mental health crisis, particularly among youth. And I think, there are a lot of people studying and looking at the impacts of social media on mental health. And so again, as physicians, I think as part of a brand, my advice is take that seriously. Think about what you put out into the world, and that doesn't mean you can't have a good time, but I do think you should realize that, again, if you want people to respect you in a certain way as a physician, and you're kind of posting stuff about healthcare and advice and the seriousness of issues of the day, if all of a sudden you start posting other things, it's going to be hard for a person to reconcile that, are these two different people? Is the same person that's talking to me about my life-threatening condition the person that posted pictures of themselves at a party? And this is how they were behaving, right? Sometimes it's unfair, but again, it goes back to the brand. It's a perception. So you have to think about that. So it doesn't mean don't use social media. It just means be mindful of what you're putting out into the world, because that's how people are going to see you. And what I always said to people, particularly our young doctors at UCLA, is that I believe that they can be leaders in the community. I think my wish for branding for our GI doctors in the community, especially given the importance of colorectal cancer screening and as a potential life-saving modality, as you all know, is you can be leaders because you already are leaders. For those of you who are trainees, you've trained in internal medicine. You've led a team at one point or another in an ICU. And eventually you've led a team on a GI consult service when you were training. And now either as a faculty member or as a physician leading an office or being part of a healthcare organization, people respect you. People look at you when you're in the endoscopy unit and you're in a room. You have nurses, you have anesthesiologists, nurse anesthetists, potentially fellows. So I think my wish is that we brand ourselves also as leaders in the community, as GI doctors, because people in the community will respect what you have to say. And what we, as a part of an integrated health system with GI doctors all around greater Los Angeles, not all of our GI doctors are on the main university campus, yet they are important members of our university community wherever they are. And so I encourage our doctors to get involved in the local organizations, even, whether it's the parent teachers associations or clubs in the community. And, I've seen such a great impact from our doctors giving talks and kind of, again, back to availability and advice in kind of formal forums, conveying their leadership and being kind of valued members of our society. And I think when we have some of our doctors using their profiles on social media, talking about, their planned educational conferences, et cetera, in the community, we see that there's actually traction. People are out there looking, they're seeing, Dr. So-and-so, how do they conduct themselves? How do they conduct themselves publicly? And when can I kind of listen to what they have to say? And I think that one of the challenges with the pandemic is obviously, for many good reasons, we've been disconnected from those in-person opportunities to kind of convey a brand or leadership. But there's a silver lining that we do have the opportunity to use this technology for good. And I've seen excellent examples of physicians utilizing technology during the pandemic to continue to reach out to people. I mean, I think for those of you involved in research publications, I think the social media platforms have allowed for physicians to interact with one another and scientists to connect with respect to publications, sharing key research advice. Obviously, during the pandemic, We've also seen excellent use of sharing data, but then also, questioning that data publicly as well. So, I don't think there's a perfect solution to this because, I think we have kind of a forum now where people are saying whatever they want to say. But again, my advice to, kind of people who are early in their careers and they're trying to formulate their profile and their public presence, I think it's important to really think about what you're putting out there. And one thing I just because I mentioned the website, I think obviously, I am involved with a lot of technological organizations. So I think about what is the future. Right now we have the internet and we have social media. I think it's really interesting for people to think, what is going to be the future? Is there going to be like a Web3 that there already is? What's the future of the internet? What is going to be the future of communication? If one or more of these current platforms are shut down, what will pop up? So it's interesting for people to be conscious of that as well. But for me, it's been unusual because I've had such a local presence and kind of a global visibility. But then, in the GI world, now what I try to do is really elevate my colleagues, because I feel like as a chief, that's your job, is not to be thinking about yourself. It's really to focus on how you can elevate the people around you and support them. And I've been very fortunate just to always have been surrounded by just unbelievable people. But I think it's my responsibility, I think, to focus on their visibility and their branding as well. So, I have the same conversation that we're having this evening, I've had many, many times with different people. And the last thing I wanted to say, and I want to definitely open it up for discussion and hear what Dr. Pointer also has to say, is that, we have a lot of doctors obviously working with biotech and pharma and scientists. So I think it's really important that you think about what you do and the fact that society is also going to view those relationships very closely. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong necessarily inherently with that, but it just means that if you're a consultant for a pharmaceutical company and you talk about that publicly, I think that sometimes there's going to be a perception that you have a conflict, and you can declare as many conflicts as you want, but I think that it may be perceived as being an inappropriate conflict. So it's just one of those things that I always have to remind people. People ask me, should I do this consulting, or should I take this position in an advisory board? And I just always remind them that, okay, how do you want to be perceived? And is that something you're comfortable with? Obviously, is it something that's allowed in your institution? First of all, that's an important thing to keep in mind. And I think that as you're kind of building a brand and you're building relationships with the outside world, always think about your home institution and what is actually allowed. Because the last thing you want to do is innocently kind of take on certain positions and then find out that it's not something that was within the guidelines of your position. And that doesn't limit itself to universities. It could even be other types of healthcare organizations or practices. So I hope that was helpful, because I tried to kind of go through a little bit my own experiences and then focus on very specific things that I think are important, especially that public perception and the use of technology, because I think it's going to be a big part of what we do always going forward. But I think it requires us to take multiple looks before we do anything. So, kind of, as I said, measure twice, cut once is something I always think about.
Wonderful. I mean, that was incredibly helpful. And I have a few questions for you, of course.
Sure,
I mean, you're obviously very accomplished. What were a few things that you feel like you did pretty early on in your career that helped you to develop the brand, that you have today? I'm thinking of, fellows just getting ready to graduate and early career GI docs who are really trying to figure out this whole branding and where they fit in in their current career positions and in social media? What were some things that you did that led you to here?
Well, thank you, Stephanie. So I think, first of all, looking at mentors and role models around me has always been something that I've done both in my GI professional life, my non-GI professional life, and my personal life. So I've been very fortunate. So, family kind of initially, but really looking at when I joined UCLA as a faculty member. Well, first of all, I mentioned Dr. Runyon. So Dr. Runyon was an amazing mentor of mine as a medical student and resident. And he was a very traditional kind of academic, he is, a traditional academic physician, but clinical. And, he had kind of trained in certain environments and had and was practicing and kind of had practiced in different environments, but he had, his own view of how to manage patients. And then when I was at UCLA as a fellow, Wilfred Weinstein was my program director, and he had another unbelievable kind of history and career. But I kind of watched how he would treat patients, and then I had like Bennett Roth and Eric Strom, two again outstanding clinical physicians. And Bennett had also been in the ASGE as president while he was in private practice. So I was very interested in Bennett and also like how he developed the RothNet, which many of you out there use. And, I was very interested in how Bennett had kind of navigated, all these different roles that he had taken in his life. And then Gary Gitnick, my chief for many, many years and a dear friend and colleague who recently passed away, was also an excellent mentor in many ways because he, I kind of learned a little bit from him about how to work in a large organization and at UCLA. So what I tried to do from all of these names I mentioned, and there are many others, so I hope no one's watching, none of them are watching because I don't want to leave anybody out. But I had the opportunity, at least in my GI career, to kind of take bits and pieces from each one of them and kind of incorporate that into the way that I see patients, treat patients, work in university, even conduct research. And I think that was relevant to me. So seeking mentors, I think is one aspect of that. And if they're not readily around you, getting them outside of the institution. I think that this era where we're in allows for that much more readily than in the past. I have people reach out to me from all over the country on a regular basis, all over the world sometimes, just asking like simple pieces of advice. And it's an honor to be able to kind of work with them on it. Whereas in the past, obviously, it would be kind of unrealistic.
Great, thank you. One question that came up that was in the emails that I received was, I'm a doctor. That's a brand in and of itself. Do I need a personal brand?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think one of the things, as I mentioned in that AMA definition, is the differentiator. So like, how do you differentiate yourself? So yeah, you're a doctor. We're all doctors, I think, on this Zoom. And I remember, I was kind of at, I can't remember where I was, but somebody came up to me and said, oh, so-and-so is a doctor, didn't know I was a doctor. And I thought, well, almost everybody I know is a doctor. So right there, like we are in a community where there are a lot of physicians. And sometimes, sorry, my phone is ringing in the background, but sometimes in communities where there's less access to care, kind of being a physician may already be a differentiator. But assuming that you're in a community where there are other physicians, and like I'll tell you, if you're in a metropolitan community like Los Angeles or New York, there are a lot of gastroenterologists. So if you want to set yourself apart, just being a physician is not good enough. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have a polished headshot and that you need to kind of buy advertising time. But what it does mean is that you need to think about what it is that you want, how you can set yourself apart. And one thing I would say is If your goal is patient care volume, then you have to think about what are patients looking for and brand yourself towards that. If your goal is a research career, then what you have to do is brand yourself as someone who is going to be competitive for grants. So it's like putting yourself into that community that is ultimately going to be, you're going to be ultimately working with, whether it's submitting grants, writing papers, kind of getting positions in societies and then moving up the ranks. It's kind of how do you make a living? I think about that all the time. How do you put food on the table is what I say to my kids, as I'm trying to say, how are you going to put food on the table? So if you're a physician scientist, there's one path. If you're a clinician, there's one path. And obviously some of these paths are going to converge for different people.
Thank you. And someone who may be looking at different career transitions, for instance, going from academics to private practice or vice versa, and they've created a brand and a name for themselves in their one arena, and they're moving to a different one. How do they make that transition and still maintain that brand as they move forward?
Well, I think, I mentioned the example of Dr. Bennett Roth. He's a perfect example because Bennett, after his training, was at UCLA. Then he was in private practice for many years and very successful. And then ultimately came back to work at UCLA. And he was heavily clinical, but he actually also is brilliant. And he would always ask the most insightful questions in journal club, even though he'd never been in a laboratory. He had that ability to do so. And, he navigated that transition very comfortably, but it was also, a long time ago. So I think in this day and age, I certainly think anything is possible. I'll tell you that, because I've basically done so many different things, I've had, one of my mentors, my late mentor, Mr. Corian, used to tell me that I've been in a million businesses and I wasn't trained in any of them, but I was successful in every one. So I think where there's a will, there's a way. But I think part of it is if somebody is leaving academia and moving into kind of a private practice role, the reality is the private practice is driven heavily by patient volume. And the revenue and the ability to have consistent revenue is what allows a practice to thrive. So that's a very kind of different mentality than someone who's mainly been a physician scientist. Even if you come from academia, a clinical academic position, it's not going to be as dramatic because even in a university like UCLA, as I mentioned, or in many other settings, revenue is a part of what we have to deal with. That's why we seek, reimbursement for procedures. We want to deliver high quality patient care, but obviously we need our organizations to get paid. We need to be able to pay our colleagues, not just the physicians, but the nurses, the anesthesiologists, the pathologists, et cetera. So I think it's less of a difficult transition when someone is coming from a more clinical academic position, but the differences are in private practice, a physician is more responsible to a group or maybe a large group and not as much the academic kind of hierarchy. Going the reverse is sometimes an interesting experience for people because they've come from maybe having a smaller group, or even if you're coming from a large group to all of a sudden have to also deal with academic requirements. So for example, at UCLA, we have for clinician educators, we have a requirement for creativity, which is some sort of publication, and we have a requirement for teaching. So someone who's come from a practice in which they are scoping all day without trainees to all of a sudden have to do some endoscopy with trainees, it's a different experience, right? So many people love it, but obviously it also means that you have to have some patience whether you're working with a trainee in endoscopy. So that's an important, I think, aspect. But from a brand standpoint, I think, academia has, so I think, some wonderful aspects that come along with it. But one of the things that you have to be more conscious of, I think, when you're kind of presenting yourself, is that you do represent a university. And that's one thing that I think is really important for everyone to remember. And back to social media, it's, I think if you look at the profiles of, some, and I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about some people that you really admire, maybe in a different university, you look at their kind of what they're projecting out into the world, it may be a little bit less personal and a little bit more about, kind of their work or their kind of role in an institution. Whereas somebody who's more, what I say, as a private citizen, may not have that same obligation.
No, that makes complete sense. I did want to ask all of our guests to be sure to ask some questions of Dr. Esrailian here. He is full of good wisdom. And back to you now. When I first got your bio, I was like, wow. And then when does he sleep? So how did you have the time? I mean, you're in film production and philanthropy and entrepreneurship. And I'm thinking about, my own schedule. How do you find the time to pivot into these different roles?
Well, I think, thank you for saying that. Very kind of you. Well, I definitely do sleep. I sleep more now, though, than I used to, I have to admit, just because I'm getting older. So I realize the importance of sleeping. So definitely you should be sleeping. As I say, like, do as I say, not as I do. No, I definitely, I've been very fortunate because I've also been able to learn time management along the way. And that's really important to me. So I pretty much schedule almost every hour of my day. So it's really tightly scheduled, and maybe it's just for my own kind of mental health. But that way, I look, even when I take a break, it's like a scheduled break. And so it allows me to kind of plan and multitask in many different ways. And, it's also, I've had incredible partners. So partnering with people on various projects is critical, and just like within a GI group, for example, or my division, I have unbelievable colleagues in my division, and we work very closely together, but everyone kind of does different things, and then we collaborate. And so that helps also with time management. So I think part of kind of being able to lead is being able to find great people to work with along the way, and also mentor people and help them achieve success and put them in positions to be maximally successful. And I tell even my kids, I think that's really important to like develop the time management skills along the way, because I mean, that's one thing. If I want people to kind of like take something away from what I do, is I want them to know that I'm organized and that I manage my time. And but I've been very fortunate. Again, it's back to what other topic we talked about was the mentorship. So I've talked about GI mentorship, but I've had unbelievable mentorship in all of these other domains. Human rights advocacy, production, investing, and I think I've learned from a lot of people. So I'm always learning. So and I think that's another, kind of like maybe for the GI community, we also should always be branding ourselves, and we do as physicians, but we're lifelong learners. That's why people go to DBW. That's why we have these types of programs from the AGA, because I mean, nobody knows everything. And I think it's kind of dangerous if somebody thinks they know everything. So I think it's really important that we're constantly evolving, constantly learning. And I think it just makes it part of the joy of life for me.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think that is one of the great lessons in all of this. Is to just be lifelong learners. I want to touch a little bit on social media before we close. I mean, we're in the age of social media. I'm on YouTube, and I see lots of physicians who have all these cool YouTube channels, and some very serious, some with a comedic slant. And you did touch on, of course, being wise and mindful of what you're posting on social media. As a young physician developing a brand, do you think it's pretty important to start developing a social media presence? And then is there any particular platform that you think in your experiences has been better for getting your name out there?
Yeah. So I think that, for academics, for people who are working in research publications, Twitter, I see as an evolution of sharing news, much more about news and research and kind of potentially publications and things in that regard. Whereas, Instagram and Facebook are much more visual. So, I know just enough to be dangerous. I'll just say, many of my friends are, incredibly influential in the social media world, and friends from my personal life. So I've learned lessons kind of from them. And that's why I've kind of taken a step back, just because I, have these other obligations, as I mentioned. So I have to be a little bit more, kind of, guarded, I would say, in what I do. And also back to your point about how do I get a lot done? It's because I really don't take a lot in from just random sources. So I'm very specific on my sources of news and information, and obviously medical information. We're blessed, so we're in the GI community. But I actually don't read the incoming, and that's a piece of advice I got from someone who has millions and millions and millions of followers, because it basically was like, okay, well, what is, especially if you take on anything that is somewhat controversial, like human rights issues. Remember, there's human rights activists and there are also human rights abusers. So when you put something out there and you're really fighting against human rights abusers, then you have to be prepared that you're going to be starting to get all sorts of interesting comments, let's just say, in your social media platforms. So that was a decision I made. Like, I'm not going to look at it. And I have some people who actually help me with that. And if there's something that's, worth me responding to, or somebody that I'm actually friends with, or somebody who wants to like communicate with me, we'll give them another opportunity to do so. But I think that, again, I think, one person wisely told me years ago, it said, do you want to be perceived as an entertainer? Which I don't. So that's one of the things is, are you trying to be an entertainer or are you a physician? This was because I was asked to be on kind of a talk show and I ended up saying no, because I didn't like where it was going, and I felt like, again, I'm not against humor. I'm actually, I love to laugh, et cetera. And I love to make people laugh, but I felt like that's not really my role publicly in society, and I think that, so I thought about that for myself. Now, for other people, it could be totally fine. But it's, it's tough for me where I'm kind of dealing with all sorts of kind of like world issues to do that. So I basically, have passed numerous times on things like that. Whereas I think, for others, like, if you're able to convey the importance of a public health issue and you can make it accessible to people around the world through some humor, I think that's different. And I think that that's very interesting. So, YouTube, so all of these platforms are more or less minimally regulated, I would say. So if you ever tried to complain about a social media post, you'll find how little effect that's going to have. Now, I'm fortunate that I have opportunities to kind of talk to people directly and say, take that down, but because it's dangerous or it's offensive or it's threatening, et cetera. But I think the normal pathways don't really work because, obviously think about how many tweets or Instagram posts or Facebook messages are out in the world. Some of these companies actually have certain algorithms to try to catch things that might be deceiving. And actually, during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, that was something that was happening. That there was some regulation. But people, I can tell you that from my friends in the tech world, TikTok right now is exploding, and TikTok is exploding amongst younger users. So that's not really our patient population, but it's just a reality of the landscape.
I agree. Thank you for that. We did get a question here from one of our guests. They asked, does advocacy in certain humanitarian issues that may be perceived as politically controversial to some interfere with your day job as a physician and division chief?
Hi, Rafi. One thing I would say no, because I'm very conscious of like what I do and again, my responsibilities, not just as a chief, but within the university, because I have an unusual situation because of course I'm a division chief, but I have responsibilities throughout the campus. But at the same time, I'm very conscious of, again, what does our institution stand for? So I discuss with, kind of the dean and department chair and the chancellor, many issues that might potentially affect the university. And for example, when there were attacks on Armenians last year in, I should say 2020, I worked with the chancellor on a statement that he put out into the world. And he is, and I've, for example, I've gone with the chancellor to Armenia in 2018, and he was very supportive of us starting the Promise Armenian Institute and the Promise Institute for Human Rights and naming it after these films. So I think, but I'm conscious of, the communities around me, and I think if you advocate for human rights, it's hard to argue against that. But to me, I think health is a human right. So I actually, again, goes back to what do we do as physicians? What is our role in society? And as I said, a lot of these human rights organizations are led by healthcare professionals too.
Great, thank you. And one last question before we wrap up here. To that, early career, a physician or trainee who's struggling with trying to fine tune their brand and they're interested in a few different things. What would be one piece of advice that you would give to them as they're trying to find their way?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I would say, don't try to manufacture something that doesn't feel organic to you. Like organic to you as a person. On the other hand, if you are a person that has a lot of great things, I'm sure you are. I mean, people out there have a lot of great things inside them. Don't let it be the best kept secret. That's to me is like, I see so many people who are brilliant, but they may not necessarily speak up in a meeting, or they're the most unbelievable caring physician, but because of the way they've structured their schedule, people can't get in to see them. So don't let yourself be the best kept secret, and think of organic ways to kind of expose your skills and great attributes to the world. And sometimes it just means, again, creating access or volunteering. Like, again, I used to think of myself as a volunteer. I still do. I'm on a bunch of different philanthropic boards, and I just keep thinking. Sometimes I'm like, oh, how did I end up in this meeting? Oh my gosh, I volunteered like 10 years ago, and I'm still here. So, but because of that, I've been able to do a lot and meet a lot of people and continue, and they get to know me, and then they ask me to do something else, and one thing leads to another. So I would say, don't let yourself be the best kept secret.
I agree. The brand should be natural and organic, and that's what'll keep people coming to you and keep your name in everyone's mouth. So that's wonderful. This has been amazing. I was so excited to hear you speak tonight after reading your bio and just learning more about you. I listened to a couple of your talks on YouTube as well. And so this has been great. And I think our audience would say the same. I'd like to just thank everyone for coming out tonight and for asking your questions and sending them in as well. I'm sure Dr. Esrailian wouldn't mind answering any if you had some things to ask him after this meeting. On behalf of the AGA, Marcia, and our trainee and early career committee and our committee chair, Peter Liang, I'd just like to thank everyone, and thank you, Dr. Liang, Dr. Esrailian, for coming out tonight and speaking with us.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for moderating.
Thank you. I do have a few things here. So there is a session evaluation that was just sent to everyone. So You'll be able to see that link there in the chat box. There are a couple of other workshops that are coming up that I think that you guys would be interested in. We have creating solutions to expand the pipeline of underrepresented minorities in GI medicine at the early stage. Dr. Esrailian did touch on that earlier in his talk. That is Wednesday, February the 16th at 8 p.m. Eastern. There's also a work-life balance session on Wednesday, March the 16th at 8 p.m. Eastern. And please, again, don't forget to complete the evaluation. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Dr. Esrailian.